Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a world stripped of everything familiar to you today. No glowing screens, no buzzing cities, no rumble of cars, no engines, no tall towers scraping the sky. Picture instead a vast earth where the wild stretched endlessly, where forests rolled over mountains, where rivers cut deep paths across fertile valleys, and where oceans lapped untouched shores. 10,000 years ago, the planet belonged almost entirely to nature. Humans were there, yes, but they were only one part of a larger tapestry, one small thread in the endless weave of animals, plants, and landscapes. To understand what people were doing 10,000 years ago is not simply to read dates on a timeline. It is to step into a world that feels both alien and strangely familiar. The year was roughly 8,000 BC, a number that feels impossibly distant. When we say 10,000 years, our minds almost cannot grasp it. For us, a century already feels like an immense span of time. Think of how much the world has changed in just the last 100 years, the rise of flight, electricity, computers, the internet. Multiply that distance by 100, and you only begin to approach the world we are about to enter. This was not ancient Rome. It was not the age of the pyramids or the golden palaces of Mesopotamia. Those wonders were still thousands of years away. 10,000 years ago, humanity was still standing on the threshold of civilization itself. Most people alive then were not kings, priests, or architects. They were ordinary men, women, and children whose daily lives revolved around survival. Picture small groups scattered across continents, tied to the rhythms of seasons, the migrations of animals, the sprouting of plants. These were the hunter-gatherers, and their lifestyle had defined humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. A typical day was not about appointments or screens, but about whether you would find enough to eat, whether you could avoid predators, and whether your community could endure the challenges of nature. Imagine waking up with the sun, stepping into crisp air, and knowing that your first thought was not, "What will I do today?" but "Where will food come from today?" That was the reality for most of the human race. Yet something extraordinary was beginning to stir. Somewhere in the valleys of the Middle East, in the stretch of land we now call the Fertile Crescent, people were experimenting with new ways of living. They were gathering wild grains, noticing how seeds fell and grew again, and slowly realizing that they could bend nature's cycles to their advantage. Instead of simply following herds or foraging forests, they began to cultivate the land, to sow and harvest, to shape the earth itself. This was the first spark of what historians call the Neolithic Revolution. It was not one single event, but a slow unfolding, a chain reaction that would transform the fate of our species forever. Farming and herding would change everything: our diets, our homes, our societies, even our beliefs. 10,000 years ago, humanity was standing right at the edge of this transformation. But let's not rush into the revolution too quickly. To really feel what life was like back then, we must first sink into the rhythm of the world as it was. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking a valley untouched by machines, where rivers ran clear and forests stretched as far as the eye could see. Herds of wild animals roamed below: deer, gazelle, bison, perhaps even mammoths in some regions. Birds filled the skies in great flocks. The air was thick with the scent of soil, pine, and wildflowers. This was the environment that shaped humans for tens of thousands of years before farming took root. The people themselves were not so different from us. Physically, they were the same species, Homo sapiens. They had the same brains, the same capacity for thought, for language, for creativity. If you dressed one of them in modern clothes and set them in a city today, you might not recognize them as being from the distant past. What separated them from us was not biology, but circumstance. Their world was simpler, rawer, closer to the ground. Knowledge was not stored in books or online. It was carried in memory, passed down in stories, songs, and rituals. Every lesson mattered because survival depended on it. A child would learn how to read tracks in the dirt, how to identify edible roots, how to craft tools from stone. Life itself was the school, and every mistake was costly. And yet, despite this constant struggle, there was beauty in their lives too. Theirs was a world of community. Families moved together, ate together, told stories around firelight. In the absence of sprawling cities, there was intimacy. Every person mattered to the survival of the group. The stars above were not obscured by neon lights. The night sky was a vast dome of brilliance, inspiring myths and guiding journeys. Art flourished even in these so-called primitive times. Cave paintings, carvings, ornaments made of bone or shell, these reveal that humans 10,000 years ago were already dreamers, already creators, already reaching beyond survival into meaning. The climate of the earth itself was shifting as well. 10,000 years ago, the last ice age was drawing to a close. Massive glaciers that had once dominated the northern continents were retreating. Landscapes were changing, forests expanding, rivers carving new paths. This environmental transformation opened up opportunities. Where once frozen tundras had stretched, now fertile lands appeared. Animals migrated into these new territories, and humans followed. It was a world in flux, both challenging and full of possibility. And this is the exact backdrop in which farming appeared. For thousands of years, humans had relied on wild plants and animals. But as the climate warmed and stable ecosystems formed, people began to notice patterns. Seeds dropped to the ground would sprout again. Animals could be tamed and kept near. Slowly, the relationship between humans and the land shifted from one of mere survival to one of control and cultivation. It is difficult to overstate how radical this change was. The choice to stay in one place, to farm instead of roam, was the beginning of everything we now take for granted: villages, towns, cities, nations, and empires. The story of humanity 10,000 years ago is the story of this choice, this crossroads. But to stand at that crossroads, we must understand the tension of the time. Imagine yourself as one of those people. You are part of a small band, maybe 30 or 40 people moving through forests and valleys. Hunting is difficult. Some days you catch enough to eat, some days you don't. Gathering is unpredictable. A sudden drought or storm can ruin the supply of fruits or nuts. You have seen children starve. You have watched elders grow weak. Now imagine you see, in another valley, a group of people beginning to stay in one place. They have fields of wheat swaying in the wind. They have animals penned near their homes. They don't have to wander as much. They seem more secure, but they also labor endlessly, digging, planting, guarding their crops. Their lives are tied to the soil. Which life would you choose? The freedom of the hunter, gatherer, or the stability of the farmer? This was not an abstract question. 10,000 years ago, it was the very real choice humans faced. It's tempting to think of this era as primitive, but in truth it was one of the most ingenious periods of human history. People adapted constantly. They invented tools that allowed them to hunt faster, fish more efficiently, and cut wood for fires and shelters. They tamed fire not just for warmth but for cooking, which unlocked more nutrition from their food. They communicated through complex languages, shared knowledge, and began to weave the beginnings of culture. In fact, one of the most astonishing finds from around this time is Göbekli Tepe, a site in modern-day Turkey. It consists of massive stone pillars carved with animals and symbols, believed to be one of the world's earliest temples. Think about that. Before cities, before farming was fully developed, humans were already building sacred spaces, gathering together for rituals, and reaching toward the divine. This tells us something profound. 10,000 years ago, Humans were not only surviving, they were also imagining. They were asking questions about life, death, nature, and meaning. They looked up at the stars and wondered. They buried their dead with care, with objects, with symbols that suggested a belief in an afterlife. They painted animals on cave walls not just to record what they saw, but perhaps to honor them, to call upon their spirits, or to preserve their memory. Their lives were hard, but their minds were alive with ideas. So, what were humans doing 10,000 years ago? They were standing at a crossroads between worlds. Behind them lay tens of thousands of years of hunting and gathering, of living lightly on the land. Ahead of them stretched the possibility of farming, of building permanent homes, of creating villages and eventually civilizations. They were experimenting, inventing, exploring, and slowly, without realizing it, laying the foundation for everything that would come after. Every city skyline today, every piece of technology, every system of government, every work of art traces its roots back to that moment when people 10,000 years ago began to shift from wandering to settling, from surviving to shaping. When we look back across that vast gulf of time, it is easy to see those people as distant, as strangers. But if you could meet them, you might find something startlingly familiar. You would see parents teaching children, friends sharing stories, communities working together. You would hear laughter around the fire, arguments over food, songs rising into the night. You would see dreams in their eyes, the same dreams that drive us still: safety, belonging, purpose, and hope. In that sense, 10,000 years ago is not so far away after all. It is the beginning of the human story we are still writing today. When we step back into the world of 10,000 years ago, before farming had truly taken hold, we find ourselves among people whose lives were deeply tied to the land, people who lived not by plowing fields, but by moving through forests, rivers, and plains in search of food. These were the hunter-gatherers, the last great representatives of a way of life that had sustained humanity for nearly all of its existence. To understand what most humans were doing 10,000 years ago is to understand this life, a life of movement, resourcefulness, danger, and beauty. A hunter-gatherer's day began with the rising of the sun. There were no alarms, no clocks, only the natural rhythm of light and darkness that governed every decision. Imagine waking up in a shelter made of branches, hides, or reeds, with the sound of birds calling and the smell of damp earth in the air. Around you, perhaps 30 or 40 others stir, family members, elders, children. Your group is small enough that everyone knows everyone, and survival depends on that closeness. You live as part of a band, not a city. There are no strangers here, only kin and companions. Food is always the central concern. There is no pantry, no stored supplies beyond a little dried meat or nuts carried from the last campsite. Each day brings the question, what will we eat today? For men and sometimes women, this often means the hunt. The hunters move out in small groups, carrying spears tipped with stone blades or perhaps bows and arrows, a tool that had already been developed and refined by this time. They follow tracks in the mud, notice the bent grass where an animal passed, study droppings to guess how long ago a herd moved through. They are trackers, reading the earth as though it were a book. When they spot prey deer, gazelle, wild boar, they must work together. Some spread out to drive the animals, others wait in ambush. The hunt is dangerous. A charging boar can kill a man. A misspent arrow means hunger. And yet, when successful, the reward is immense. Meat for days, hides for clothing, bones for tools. The kill is not only a victory but also a ritual, often accompanied by gestures of respect toward the animal's spirit. To modern eyes, this might seem superstitious, but to them it was a way of acknowledging the deep bond between hunter and hunted, life and death. While some hunted, others gathered. Women, children, and elders often took on this task, though in truth the roles could blur. Gathering meant long hours searching for edible roots, nuts, fruits, and seeds. Knowledge of plants was vital, which berries could be eaten, which leaves healed wounds, which roots were poisonous. This knowledge was not written down but carried in memory, passed orally from generation to generation. A grandmother might show a child which flower could be brewed for medicine, which mushroom was safe, which was deadly. In this sense, every member of the group carried part of the encyclopedia of survival in their minds. The balance between hunting and gathering varied from place to place. In some regions, rich in game, hunting might provide the majority of food. In others, plants and seeds were the staple, with meat as a rare prize. Rivers and coasts offered yet another bounty: fish, shellfish, water birds. 10,000 years ago, fishing technology was already advanced. Hooks carved from bone, nets woven from plant fibers, spears sharpened to catch fast, moving fish. For those who lived near lakes or seas, fishing was as important as hunting. Life was not easy, but it was flexible. When resources ran low in one place, the group packed up and moved. Mobility was their greatest advantage. They followed the herds, the ripening of fruits, the spawning of fish. They were nomads, carrying only what they could transport on their backs. This mobility also meant freedom. No one was tied to a plot of land, no one burdened by heavy possessions. The world itself was their home, and they moved through it with deep awareness. But mobility came with constant challenges. Shelter was temporary, a tent of animal hides, a lean-to of branches, sometimes a cave if one was available. Fire was essential, both for warmth and for protection against predators. Lions, leopards, wolves, all were real threats. Imagine the terror of hearing a predator in the night, the safety of firelight flickering against the darkness. Fire was also the center of community. At night, people gathered around it to cook food, to share stories, to sing. Around the fire, children learned from elders, couples bonded, myths were told. It was the hearth of both survival and culture. Hunter-gatherer life was also surprisingly egalitarian compared to later farming societies. Because survival required cooperation, no single person could dominate entirely. Men hunted, but women's gathering often provided the majority of daily calories. Both roles were essential, and both carried knowledge and skill. Leadership existed, but it was fluid, based on respect, wisdom, and ability rather than inherited power. Decisions were often made collectively, by discussion, by tradition, by consensus. This balance would shift later with farming, when land ownership and food storage created hierarchies, but in the age of the hunter-gatherer, equality was a necessity. Despite their hardships, these people were not always starving or miserable. In fact, some anthropologists argue that hunter-gatherers had more leisure time than early farmers. Once the food of the day was secured, the rest of the hours could be spent resting, repairing tools, crafting ornaments, or telling stories. The pace of life was tied to nature, not to the relentless labor of plowing fields. That is not to romanticize their struggles. Illness, injury, and hunger were constant risks. But it reminds us that life then was not simply brutish. It had rhythms, joys, and celebrations. We know from archaeology that hunter-gatherers created art. Cave paintings tens of thousands of years old show animals in vibrant motion, sometimes hunted, sometimes revered. Ornaments made of shells, beads, or carved bone have been found in graves. This tells us that these people valued beauty, symbolism, and expression. They were not only concerned with survival, but also with meaning. 10,000 years ago, this tradition continued. To sit in a cave and paint an image of a bison by firelight was to connect with something beyond the immediate hunger of the day. It was to say, we are more than our needs, we are storytellers, creators, dreamers. And stories mattered. Oral traditions kept knowledge alive. Around the fire, myths explained the stars, the seasons, the cycles of birth and death. Some stories warned of dangers. Don't eat this plant, beware of this animal. Others gave comfort, weaving meaning into hardship. Children grew up listening, memorizing, carrying forward the wisdom of their people. In this way, knowledge was immortal, even when individuals passed away. Death itself was not ignored but treated with ritual. Graves from this period often contain objects, stools, ornaments, sometimes animal bones. This suggests a belief that the dead needed these things in another life, or that burying them was a way of honoring their spirit. Such practices show that hunter-gatherers were not just surviving but living with a sense of the sacred, a recognition that life was part of something larger, but life on the move was not without danger. Injuries could be fatal without modern medicine. A broken bone might mean death if one could no longer keep up with the group. Childbirth was perilous. Diseases spread less than in farming villages, but they still existed, often striking swiftly. Hunger loomed when animals migrated too far or when drought struck. The fragility of life was always present, a shadow against every fire, and yet humans endured. Their adaptability, their resilience, carried them through. As the Ice Age ended and climates shifted, some hunter-gatherers began to encounter farming communities. At first, these were rare, scattered, experimental, but the contrast was stark. Farmers stayed in one place, worked the land, grew food in abundance. Hunter-gatherers could see both the benefits and the burdens of this new life. Some groups resisted, clinging to their mobility. Others blended, adopting farming slowly. But 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers still represented the dominant way of life across most of the globe. They were the carriers of humanity's oldest traditions, the guardians of skills honed over countless generations. Their lives remind us of something essential, that for most of our history, we lived not as masters of the earth, but as participants in its cycles. We walked lightly, taking what we needed, moving when resources ran thin. We were dependent, vulnerable, and yet deeply connected to the world around us. To imagine their lives is to strip away the noise of modern existence and return to something elemental. It is to feel the cold bite of morning air, the thrill of a successful hunt, the warmth of a shared fire. It is to see the world not as a backdrop, but as a living presence. 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers were still thriving, still adapting, still shaping their world with every choice. They did not know that farming would soon change everything, that villages would rise, that civilizations would follow. For them, the horizon was the next valley, the next hunt, the next season's fruit. And yet, unknowingly, they stood at the edge of history, carrying forward the memory of a way of life that had sustained us for nearly all of human time. Their story is not one of failure or backwardness. It is the foundation of who we are. If you could stand on a hillside in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago, you might notice something strange, something different from the endless rhythm of hunting and wandering that had defined human existence for millennia. There, in the valleys between rivers, you would see patches of land cleared of wild growth, tilled soil where seeds had been deliberately scattered, and small clusters of people tending to the plants as though they were children. In nearby enclosures, animals that once roamed wild now lingered close, herded together, their movements no longer entirely their own. This was the birth of farming, a transformation so profound that it altered not only what humans ate, but how they lived, how they thought, and ultimately how history itself would unfold. It did not begin in a single day, nor was it the work of a single genius. Instead, farming emerged slowly, almost quietly, as people began to notice patterns in the natural world. A gatherer who carried home a bundle of wild grains might drop seeds near a camp. and months later see those same plants sprouting. Over time, they realized that seeds could be deliberately placed in the ground, watered, and harvested later. What began as accident became experiment, and what began as experiment became practice. At first, it must have seemed almost magical, the power to coax life from soil, to turn scattered grains into an intentional harvest. For people accustomed to uncertainty, to the constant question of where tomorrow's meal would come from, this new control was revolutionary. The Fertile Crescent, stretching through parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Turkey, provided the perfect conditions. Its rivers, like the Tigris and Euphrates, nourished valleys rich in wild wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. These plants, already nutritious and resilient, became the first candidates for domestication. Humans began to select seeds from the best plants, those with larger grains, those that grew reliably, and over generations, these choices shaped the crops into forms more suited to cultivation. It was unconscious at first, but it was the beginning of agriculture. Alongside crops came animals. Hunters had long known which creatures were dangerous, which were docile, which followed predictable patterns. Goats, sheep, and later cattle and pigs became the first animals to be domesticated. Unlike the unpredictable chase of a wild hunt, herding offered stability. A goat could provide milk daily, not just meat once. Sheep offered wool for clothing, hides for shelter, and eventually a renewable resource that made life more secure. Herds could move with the people or remain near settlements, tethering humans and animals into a relationship that blurred the boundary between wild and tame. The decision to farm and herd was not made without cost. Farming was labor-intensive, where hunter-gatherers might spend hours a day gathering what nature offered. Farmers bent their backs from dawn until dusk. They dug soil with stone hoes, carried water from rivers, guarded their crops against pests and wild animals. Failure could be devastating. If rains failed, if a crop was struck by disease, entire stores of food could vanish. For the first time, humans placed themselves at the mercy of the weather in a new way, tied not to the migration of herds, but to the success of a field. And yet, the promise of surplus, the chance to have food stored for the future, was powerful enough to outweigh the risks. Imagine being part of one of these early farming communities. Each morning, you wake not to roam across the land, but to return to the same patch of earth, to check on seedlings, to repair a pen for your animals. Children run between huts. Elders watch the sky for signs of rain, and everyone knows that their survival now depends not on the day's luck in the hunt, but on the patient work of weeks and months. It is a new rhythm, one that ties people to place. Villages emerge almost as a necessity because fields and herds require care that cannot be abandoned. For the first time, permanence becomes part of human life. The shift was not universal. Many groups resisted, clinging to the old ways of mobility and hunting. To them, the farmers may have seemed enslaved to the soil, working endlessly for food that could just as easily be gathered elsewhere. And in truth, early farming did not always mean better health. Archaeological evidence shows that the first farmers often suffered more malnutrition than hunter-gatherers, their diets limited by dependence on a few crops. Diseases also spread more easily in permanent settlements, especially those connected to close living with animals. Life expectancy sometimes dropped, yet, despite these drawbacks, farming had an irresistible advantage: numbers. A field of wheat could feed many more people than the same land left wild. Populations grew, villages expanded, and over time, the farmers began to dominate simply by sheer weight of numbers. But farming was not just about food. It changed the very structure of human society. Surplus meant storage, and storage meant ownership. A basket of grain could be set aside for winter, could be traded with a neighbor, could even be stolen. This introduced new concepts: wealth, property, inequality. In hunter-gatherer bands, where everyone moved and shared, accumulation was limited. But in farming communities, some could gather more than others. Those with the best land, the strongest fields, or the largest herds gained power. Slowly, leadership shifted from respect earned through skill to authority based on control of resources. This was the seed not just of agriculture, but of politics, hierarchy, and eventually kingdoms. The act of farming also changed how humans saw time. A hunter-gatherer's world was cyclical, following the movements of herds, the changing of seasons. But farmers needed to measure time more precisely. When should seeds be planted? When would rains come? When should harvests be stored? This necessity gave rise to calendars, to careful observation of the stars, to the beginnings of astronomy. Time itself became something measurable, predictable, not just experienced but calculated. Farming, in this sense, was the mother of science. Spiritual life, too, was transformed. For hunter-gatherers, the sacred was often found in the animals they hunted, the spirits of the forest, the mysteries of the night sky. For farmers, the cycle of planting and harvest became sacred. Gods and goddesses of fertility, rain, and earth emerged in mythologies around the world. Rituals developed to ensure good harvests, to thank the land, to pray for rain. The earth itself became divine, and humans began to see themselves as not just participants in nature, but manipulators of it, co-creators with the soil. Sites like Göbekli Tepe may even reflect this shift, a temple rising not for wandering hunters, but for communities gathering around shared rituals tied to land and food. Technology advanced quickly under the pressures of farming life. Tools for digging, grinding, and harvesting multiplied. Pottery became essential for storing grain and water. Its invention a silent revolution that allowed food to be preserved for months. Weaving grew in importance, with fibers from plants and animals turned into clothing and baskets. Permanent homes were built from mud bricks, stronger and more enduring than temporary shelters. In short, the Neolithic era was a time of constant invention, driven by the demands of a settled, agricultural life. It is important to remember, though, that this revolution did not happen everywhere at once. While the Fertile Crescent pioneered farming, other parts of the world followed at different times and with different crops. In China, millet and rice became staples. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash were domesticated. In Africa, sorghum and yams. Each region adapted its local plants and animals, creating unique agricultural traditions. 10,000 years ago, the revolution was only beginning, a spark in a few regions, but one that would spread across continents over millennia. The shift to farming also reshaped relationships within communities. Women, once central to gathering, became tied to fields and households in new ways. Their role in food production remained vital, but the growing emphasis on property and inheritance began to shift power dynamics. Children, too, took on new roles, helping with planting and herding from a young age. The very structure of family life was reshaped by the demands of agriculture, laying foundations for gender roles and social hierarchies that would echo for thousands of years. For those living through it, this transformation may not have seemed like a revolution at all. It was gradual, unfolding over generations. A child born into a farming village did not think of themselves as part of a new era. They simply worked the fields as their parents did, just as hunter-gatherers once taught their children to forage and hunt. The revolution is clearer to us looking back than it was to them. And yet, Every seed planted, every animal tamed, every basket of grain stored was a step away from the world of the wild and a step toward the world of civilization. Consider for a moment the symbolism of seed and soil. In planting, humans took part in creation, shaping life itself. That act carried immense meaning, even if it was not consciously recognized. It gave humans a sense of control, of mastery over nature. Yet it also bound them more tightly to the earth than ever before. A hunter-gatherer could walk away from a barren forest. A farmer could not walk away from a failed field. Farming was both liberation and bondage, empowerment and vulnerability. That paradox still lingers with us today as we wrestle with our relationship to the land and the natural world. So what were humans doing 10,000 years ago? They were bending down to the soil, planting the first fields of wheat and barley, watching goats in pens and sheep grazing near their homes. They were making choices that would ripple through history, choices that would lead to villages, to cities, to empires, to nations. They were inventing a new way of being human, one rooted not in the endless movement across the land, but in the permanence of place. They did not know it, but in choosing to farm, they were setting the stage for everything to come. Writing, government, religion, war, trade, art, and science. Farming was not simply about food, it was about reshaping the human story itself, and though it began quietly, in fields tilled by stone tools under the hot sun, its echoes still shape us today. Every loaf of bread, every meal of rice, every pasture of grazing cattle traces its lineage back to that moment 10,000 years ago, when humans first looked at the wild abundance of the earth and decided to cultivate, to control, to sow and reap. It was a choice that bound us forever to the land, and it was the beginning of civilization itself. Imagine walking through a cluster of small dwellings 10,000 years ago, in a world where farming had just begun to change the rhythm of human life. The air is filled with the smell of wood smoke and freshly baked bread made from crushed grains. Children laugh and chase each other through narrow pathways between mud brick houses, while adults bend over grinding stones, pound grain, and tend to goats bleating in nearby enclosures. What you are seeing is something entirely new in human history, not a temporary camp, not a seasonal gathering, but a permanent village. This was the next great step in the story of humanity, and its consequences were as profound as the first seed planted in the earth. For countless generations before, people had moved constantly, following the seasons and the herds. Camps were temporary, shelters easily abandoned, possessions limited to what could be carried. The idea of staying in one place permanently was almost unimaginable. But farming and herding required care over long periods of time. Fields had to be planted and watched, herds had to be kept close, and food stores had to be guarded. Slowly, mobility gave way to permanence, and permanence created the first settlements. Villages began as simple clusters of huts or shelters, sometimes near rivers, sometimes on fertile plains, sometimes close to natural resources like stone or clay. The earliest were small, often only a few families, bound together by kinship and necessity. But what made them revolutionary was not their size, it was their stability. For the first time in history, humans built places not to leave, but to remain. Life in these villages was different in every way from the old ways of the hunt. Time no longer revolved solely around the chase or the immediate needs of survival. Instead, it was shaped by cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting. Each season brought predictable tasks: the preparation of fields, the sowing of seeds, the gathering of harvests, the storing of surplus. Houses were built with more care, often from mud bricks, wood, or stone, with hearths for cooking and storage pits for food. Some were arranged around courtyards or central spaces, where families gathered for meals, rituals, or discussions. Unlike temporary shelters, these homes were designed to endure, to last through years, even decades. With permanence came investment. People decorated walls, crafted furniture, and created spaces that reflected not just necessity, but identity. The village also reshaped human relationships. In a nomadic band, the group might be small, 20 to 50 individuals, moving together with a shared sense of survival. But in a village, dozens or even hundreds of people could live side by side. This density required new forms of cooperation, new rules, and new ways of resolving conflict. The sharing of irrigation water, the defense of fields from animals or rivals, the organization of communal work, these required coordination. Slowly, leadership and social structures emerged. Perhaps at first these were informal, based on respect for elders or skilled farmers, but over time, authority became more formalized. The seeds of governance were sown in these villages, just as the seeds of wheat were sown in the fields nearby. Archaeological sites like Jericho and Catalhoyuk give us glimpses into this early village life. Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, may be one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, with evidence of walls and towers built nearly 10,000 years ago. Imagine the effort it took for a small community to construct such monumental structures, not for temporary use, but for lasting defense and identity. Catalhoyuk, in modern-day Turkey, reveals a dense settlement of interconnected mud, brick houses without streets, where people moved across rooftops instead of pathways. Inside these homes, walls were decorated with murals, shrines contained figurines, and burials took place beneath floors. These were not simple shelters. They were places rich with symbolism, culture, and a growing sense of belonging. The rise of villages also changed how people thought about land. In the old world of nomads, land was shared, open, something moved across freely. But in a settled community, land became something to claim, to divide, to pass down to children. This shift created new ideas of ownership and inheritance. Boundaries were marked, disputes arose, and the concept of private property, so central to later civilizations, was born. With it came inequality. Some families possessed better land or larger herds, others less. Some stored surpluses while others struggled. Over generations, these differences hardened into social divisions, the earliest beginnings of class. Daily life in these villages was full of both hardship and innovation. Farming required long hours of labor, and tools had to be crafted to meet the demands of the fields. Grinding stones were used to crush grain, clay pots to store it, woven baskets to carry it. Fire had to be kept burning for cooking, warmth, and protection. Children played but also worked, helping herd animals, fetch water, or guard crops. Women, often central to the processing of food, also took on new roles as caretakers of homes and fields. Men often focused on hunting when possible, herding animals, or engaging in heavier labor like construction. But in truth, survival was a shared responsibility, and every pair of hands mattered. The very closeness of village life created new challenges. Disease spread more easily among groups living in tight quarters, especially when combined with the presence of domesticated animals. Infections that might have been rare in small, mobile bands could sweep through settled populations with devastating effects. Waste management became an issue, and sanitation practices had to evolve slowly. Yet, these challenges also pushed innovation. As populations grew, humans had to find ways to adapt, to dig wells, to create drainage, to maintain health within crowded spaces. Villages were not just centers of survival, they became centers of culture. With permanent homes, people could create art not just for travel, but for display. Murals, carvings, figurines, and jewelry flourished. Ritual spaces emerged, shrines built within homes or central communal areas. Ancestors were buried beneath floors, connecting the living to the dead in a direct, physical way. Memory itself became tied to place. A family could point to a home where generations had lived, to a field worked by their ancestors, to a shrine built for their gods. This connection to place gave rise to identity, to heritage, to history. Trade began to flourish between villages. No community had everything it needed, and the movement of obsidian for tools, shells for decoration, or exotic stones for ritual objects shows that networks of exchange stretched far beyond a single settlement. This trade not only enriched material life, but connected distant communities, spreading ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Over time, these networks would become the arteries of civilizations. But even at this early stage, they reveal the growing complexity of human society. The psychological transformation of village life cannot be overstated. For the first time, humans could imagine a future tied to a single place. A child born in a village could expect to grow up, marry, and die in the same place, buried beneath the same floors as their ancestors. This stability created new ways of thinking about time, legacy, and continuity. The earth itself became layered with memory, each generation building on the last. While nomadic life had emphasized adaptation and mobility, village life emphasized permanence and growth. This shift shaped human consciousness in ways that still echo today. Of course, not everything about village life was idyllic. With permanence came conflict. Disputes over land, resources, or leadership could no longer be solved by simply moving away. Neighbors could not escape one another. Tensions simmered, and violence, once limited to brief clashes between bands, became more sustained. The construction of walls, like those at Jericho, suggests a need for defense against both animals and other humans. War, in its earliest form, was born from the need to protect land and surplus. For the first time, human beings were not just fighting for survival in the wild. They were fighting each other for control of settled life. Villages also changed humanity's relationship with the natural world. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers diverted for irrigation, animals bred selectively for human needs. The environment was no longer simply a backdrop, but a resource to be managed, altered, and controlled. This gave humans power, but also responsibility, as overuse of land could lead to depletion, soil exhaustion, or conflict with surrounding ecosystems. The first environmental impacts of humanity began in these early villages, setting patterns that would continue into the present. It is astonishing to think how quickly villages transformed into larger communities. Once the idea of permanence took hold, growth was inevitable. Populations expanded, more houses were built, and settlements became towns. From towns would come cities, and from cities, civilizations. The village was the seed of everything to follow. Every modern city, every nation, every empire traces its roots back to those clusters of mud, brick homes, those first permanent hearths, those paths worn into the earth by generations who chose to stay. So, 10,000 years ago, as people planted crops and herded animals, they also gathered together in the first villages. They built homes, raised families, buried their dead, decorated their walls, traded with neighbors, and defended what they had. They were inventing a new way of living, one that transformed humanity from wanderers to settlers, from bands to communities, from survival to society. They may not have known it, but they were laying the foundations for everything that would follow: government, religion, art, trade, cities, and civilizations. The sound of those early villages still echoes through history. In the laughter of children playing in courtyards, in the rhythm of grinding stones, in the smoke rising from hearths, we hear the birth of human society as we know it. It was not glamorous, not easy, and not without suffering. But it was the moment when humanity truly began to root itself in the earth, to create places called home, to build not just shelters but communities. And in that act, they changed forever the way humans would live, think, and dream. As humans settled into villages and began living side by side in larger numbers than ever before, something subtle but immensely powerful began to unfold. For countless generations, survival had been the central task of life, finding food, keeping warm, protecting children, and fending off danger. But when farming in villages created a measure of stability, when food could be stored, when homes became permanent, people found themselves with something new, time. This time was not free of labor or struggle, but it was different. It allowed space for reflection, imagination, and expression, and from this space came culture. Humans began to create not only tools and shelters, but stories, rituals, symbols, and shared meanings. Belief systems were born, shaping the way people understood themselves, their world, and the mysteries that surrounded them. If you could step into one of these early villages, you might notice signs of culture everywhere. On the walls of houses, images painted in red ochre or black charcoal, sometimes of animals, sometimes of abstract designs. On the ground, small figurines shaped from clay or stone, often representing women with exaggerated features, perhaps symbols of fertility or the earth itself. In certain spaces, unusual arrangements of stones or bones hinting at ritual. These were not simply practical objects. They carried meaning, perhaps sacred meaning. They were ways of connecting to forces beyond the everyday, to the cycles of nature, to life and death. Belief in unseen forces was not new. Even hunter-gatherers had rich spiritual lives, revering animals, spirits, and ancestors. But in settled life, belief took new forms. Agriculture tied human survival directly to the cycles of the earth, the fertility of the soil, the return of the rains, the warmth of the sun. It was natural to see these forces as divine, to honor them, to seek their favor. Fertility goddesses, rain gods, sun deities, and earth spirits appeared in myths and rituals. Life itself became a sacred cycle mirrored in the planting of seeds, their growth, and their eventual harvest. To plant was to trust the earth, to harvest was to celebrate abundance, to store grain was to prepare for the darkness of winter. Religion in many ways was born from the soil, from the rhythm of farming, from the desire to understand and influence the forces that determined survival. In these villages, ritual and daily life were not separate. A woman grinding grain might sing chants learned from her mother, invoking blessings on the food. A man tending animals might whisper to the spirits of the herd. Children played games that imitated planting or hunting, teaching them not only skills but stories. At night, around fires, elders told myths of ancestors, spirits, and gods, weaving narratives that explained why the rains fell, why the sun rose, why life and death cycled endlessly. These stories gave meaning to the struggles of farming, comfort to the inevitability of death, and hope for the uncertainties of life. Culture also began to flourish in art. Permanent homes meant permanent spaces to decorate. Murals at Catalhoyuk, for example, show not only animals but also human figures, symbols, and perhaps even maps of the settlement. This suggests that people were not only recording their world but interpreting it, turning lived experience into shared vision. Figurines, particularly those of women, are among the most common artifacts of this period. Some scholars believe they represent fertility goddesses, worshipped to ensure good harvests and healthy children. Others think they may have been household charms, tokens of luck or protection. Whatever their exact purpose, they reveal a society deeply engaged with symbolism, with representing the unseen through physical form. Burial practices also reveal the rise of belief. Many early villages buried their dead beneath the floors of homes, sometimes accompanied by ornaments, tools, or offerings. This suggests a belief in life beyond death, or at least a desire to keep ancestors close. The living and the dead shared the same space, binding families across generations, weaving memory into the very foundations of homes. Some skulls were even plastered and decorated, perhaps as ancestral relics, honored and preserved as sources of wisdom and protection. This intimacy with the dead speaks of a world, in which life and death were not sharply divided but interwoven, where ancestors continued to participate in the life of the community. As populations grew and villages connected through trade, ideas spread more widely. Belief systems began to take on regional character. The gods of the earth in one valley might be known by different names in another, but they reflected similar concerns: fertility, rain, harvest, life, and death. Rituals developed: seasonal festivals marking planting and harvest, rites of passage marking birth, adulthood, marriage, and death. These rituals unified communities, binding individuals into a shared identity. To participate in ritual was to belong, to affirm one's place within the cycle of life and the order of the world. It is easy to underestimate the importance of these cultural developments, but they were as revolutionary as farming itself. Without shared stories, beliefs, and rituals, large communities cannot function. Cooperation requires trust, and trust is built on shared meaning. Myths explained why the community existed, why people should care for one another, why they should sacrifice for the whole. Rituals reminded everyone of their dependence on each other and on the forces of nature. Symbols gave shape to abstract ideas, making the invisible visible, the mysterious familiar. In this way, culture and belief provided the glue that held early societies together. But culture was not only about religion, it was also about knowledge. Settled life required new skills, and those skills had to be remembered and passed on. Oral traditions carried wisdom across generations: when to plant, how to read the stars, how to heal with herbs, how to manage animals. Songs, chants, and stories became repositories of practical knowledge wrapped in cultural meaning. The first calendars may have been less about abstract time and more about survival, a way to mark the right moment to sow seeds or to expect floods. Slowly, the observation of nature became ritualized, and ritual became a form of knowledge. The line between science and religion did not yet exist. Both were intertwined in the same effort to understand and shape the world. The rise of belief systems also altered social roles. Certain individuals began to take on specialized positions as shamans, priests, or ritual leaders. These figures mediated between the human and the divine, guiding rituals, interpreting omens, and preserving sacred stories. Their authority was not based on physical power, but on access to spiritual knowledge. In many ways, they were the first intellectuals, the first keepers of wisdom. Over time, their role would grow, leading to organized priesthoods and eventually to religious institutions that shaped civilizations. But even at this early stage, the seeds of spiritual leadership were present, and with them the beginnings of authority based on belief. Art, ritual, myth, and leadership were not luxuries, they were survival strategies. In a world where crops might fail, where diseases might strike, where floods or droughts could destroy a community, belief systems offered a framework for hope and resilience. They explained suffering as part of a larger order, offered rituals to restore balance, and gave people a sense of control, however symbolic, over the uncontrollable. They also gave comfort in the face of death, promising continuity through ancestors or spiritual realms. For humans who are uniquely aware of their own mortality, such beliefs were not optional, they were essential. At the same time, cultural expression also allowed for joy. Music, dance, and art were not only sacred but celebratory. Festivals likely included singing, drumming, and feasting. These events built bonds, relieved tension, and affirmed community. They gave rhythm to life beyond the seasons of farming, adding beauty and pleasure to existence. In this sense, culture was not only about survival, it was about making life worth living. One of the most striking aspects of early culture is how universal certain themes were. Across distant regions, figurines of women, depictions of animals, and rituals of burial appear again and again. This suggests that humans everywhere grappled with the same questions. Where do we come from? What sustains life? What happens after death? Even separated by geography, cultures arrived at similar answers, shaped by the shared human experience of birth, survival, and loss. These universal themes hint at a common thread in the human psyche, a shared imagination that transcended time and place. The rise of culture and belief also laid the foundations for inequality and power. Those who claimed to speak for the gods or control rituals often gained influence. Surplus food could be offered as sacrifice, enriching religious leaders. Authority was no longer just about who held land or herds, but who held sacred knowledge. This interplay of belief and power would shape civilizations for millennia, creating both harmony and conflict, both comfort and oppression. Religion could unify, but it could also divide, justify inequality, or inspire war. Even in its earliest form, the double-edged nature of belief was present. Yet, it is important to remember that for those living in these villages, culture was not an abstract concept. It was the texture of daily life. A child grew up hearing myths at bedtime, learning chants during work, watching rituals during festivals. A woman shaped a clay figurine not as art for display, but as a living symbol of her hopes for fertility or protection. A man carved an image into a wall, not as an artist, but as a participant in a shared vision of the world. Culture was lived, embodied, inseparable from survival. It was not entertainment, but identity, not optional, but essential. As villages grew into towns and towns into cities, these cultural forms would become more elaborate. Temples would rise, myths would become epics, rituals would turn into organized religions. But the roots of all of this were planted in those first settlements, in the daily acts of belief and expression that gave meaning to the lives of ordinary people. 10,000 years ago, humans were not only planting seeds in the earth, they were planting seeds of culture in the human imagination. Those seeds would grow into the vast forests of art, religion, philosophy, and science that define human civilization today. So what were humans doing 10,000 years ago? They were grinding grain and baking bread, yes. They were herding animals and tending fields, yes. But they were also painting walls, shaping figurines, burying ancestors, telling stories, singing songs, dancing at festivals, and whispering prayers to the gods of earth and sky. They were weaving meaning into survival, turning existence into experience, life into story. They were creating culture, and through culture, they were becoming fully human. And in those stories, songs, and rituals, we can hear the first echoes of everything that would come after. The hymns of temples, the myths of nations, the art of civilizations, the philosophies of thinkers. 10,000 years ago, the human spirit was awakening, expressing itself not only in work, but in wonder, not only in survival, but in belief. It was the dawn of culture, the birth of imagination, the rise of systems that would guide humanity for millennia to come. By the time humanity had spent centuries farming fields, tending animals, and gathering in villages, something irreversible had begun to unfold. Step by step, the scattered patches of cultivation became permanent settlements, and the settlements grew into towns. With each generation, people became more deeply tied to land, to surplus, to trade, and to ritual. And then, slowly, a threshold was crossed. Villages ceased to be merely places of survival and became centers of organization, innovation, and complexity. This was the dawn of civilization, a transition so immense that it transformed the very fabric of human existence and set the stage for everything that followed in history. If you could travel back and walk through one of the great early sites like Sumer in Mesopotamia, or the Nile Valley in Egypt, or the Indus River plains, you would sense something utterly different from the world of small Neolithic villages. Instead of clusters of mud, brick houses surrounded by fields, you would find organized streets, monumental architecture, irrigation canals, marketplaces, workshops, and temples rising high above the dwellings. People bustled not only with the work of survival, but with the labor of administration, trade, worship, and craftsmanship. Something greater than any single family or clan was being created, a collective identity that extended far beyond kinship, a system that would endure beyond the lives of individuals. The roots of this transformation lay in surplus. Farming villages that produced more food than their inhabitants could consume suddenly had something extraordinary: abundance. That surplus allowed some people to specialize in roles beyond farming. A man who no longer had to spend all his days in the field could become a potter, a weaver, a builder, a toolmaker. A woman relieved from endless agricultural labor could devote herself to healing, ritual, or storytelling. This specialization multiplied skills, created new trades, and encouraged exchange. Villages no longer consisted of farmers alone. They became networks of diverse roles, each supporting the others. Out of this interdependence, the structure of civilization emerged. The management of surplus required organization. Grain had to be stored in communal facilities, often guarded and measured. Disputes over land or harvests had to be settled. Irrigation systems, canals, and dikes needed coordinated labor far beyond the capacity of individual families. This necessity gave rise to the first systems of governance. Leaders, councils, or chiefs began to take on authority, not merely as respected elders, but as administrators of resources and mediators of conflicts. Their power was tied not only to personal skill, but to the ability to organize collective action. Over time, leadership solidified into hierarchy, hierarchy into institutions, and institutions into states. Religion was deeply intertwined with this process. In the earliest civilizations, temples were not just places of worship. They were economic and political centers. Priests oversaw offerings, recorded harvests, and managed surplus. To give grain to the temple was to invest in both the gods and the community. The temple stored wealth, distributed food, and legitimized leaders. Rulers claimed divine sanction, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods or even as gods themselves. In this way, belief systems that had once centered on fertility and ancestors became the foundation for political authority. Power was not only earthly but cosmic, reinforced by ritual and myth. The rise of writing was one of the most revolutionary consequences of this growing complexity. In Mesopotamia, the need to record grain deliveries, tax obligations, and temple offerings led to the development of cuneiform wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets. In Egypt, the combination of administration and ritual produced hieroglyphs, a system of writing both practical and sacred. In the Indus Valley, seals with mysterious symbols suggest another form of record keeping, still undeciphered. Writing transformed human memory, allowing knowledge to extend beyond a single generation. It created history itself, moving humanity from the world of oral tradition into the permanence of written record. Laws, myths, transactions, and observations could now endure beyond the lifespan of their creators, anchoring civilization in continuity. Alongside writing came monumental architecture, the most visible sign of early civilizations. Temples like the ziggurats of Mesopotamia rose like mountains of brick, dominating the skyline and signaling both divine presence and human power. In Egypt, pyramids soared above the desert, tombs for kings but also symbols of eternity. In the Indus Valley, great baths and granaries demonstrated collective planning. These structures were more than buildings, they were declarations. They announced that humans were no longer merely surviving within nature, but reshaping it, bending earth and stone into lasting monuments. They embodied the new scale of human ambition. Trade expanded dramatically as towns grew into cities. Surplus food could be exchanged for materials not locally available: obsidian, copper, tin, precious stones. From these exchanges came new technologies like bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that created stronger tools and weapons. Bronze Age civilizations flourished on this foundation, spreading across regions and linking distant cultures through networks of exchange. For the first time, humans were not only connected by kinship or proximity, but by systems of trade that crossed mountains, rivers, and seas. Civilizations became interdependent, and with interdependence came both prosperity and vulnerability. As cities swelled, social hierarchies deepened. Farmers remained the backbone of society, providing the food that sustained everyone else. But artisans, merchants, priests, and rulers occupied distinct classes above them. Slavery emerged as captured enemies or indebted individuals were forced into labor. Inequality grew sharper, codified into laws and reinforced by culture. For some, civilization meant security and abundance. For others, it meant subjugation and toil. Yet the system as a whole endured because it created more than it destroyed, at least in its early stages. Civilization offered stability, identity, and possibility, even as it demanded submission to new hierarchies. The psychological shift from village to civilization was immense. In a small community, everyone knew each other. Decisions were personal, disputes resolved within familiar networks. But in a city of thousands, anonymity emerged. People encountered strangers daily, interacted in markets, obeyed rulers they might never meet. To manage this scale, systems of law and order were necessary. The first codes of law, like Hammurabi's in Mesopotamia, laid down rules for justice, property, and punishment. These laws were not only practical, they were symbolic, embodying the principle that order could exist beyond personal ties, that society could function through shared norms enforced by authority. Culture, too, flourished in new ways. Writing allowed myths to be recorded as epics: the stories of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, the hymns to gods in Egypt, the Rig Veda in the Indus and later Vedic traditions. These texts preserved not only belief but imagination, capturing humanity's deepest fears and hopes. Music, dance, and theater evolved as communal arts, performed in temples or public spaces. Art became more sophisticated, with sculptures, paintings, and jewelry displaying both craftsmanship and symbolic meaning. Civilization turned culture from household expression into collective identity, producing works that endured for millennia. At the heart of early civilizations was the city itself, a new kind of human environment. The city was not merely a cluster of houses. It was a structured space, often divided into districts for trade, religion, governance, and residence. Streets were planned, sometimes with drainage and sanitation systems. Markets buzzed with activity, temples stood as focal points, and palaces housed rulers. To live in a city was to experience density, diversity, and complexity unknown to earlier generations. The city was a microcosm of civilization, embodying its order, its inequality, its creativity, and its ambition. Yet, with all its wonders, the dawn of civilization also brought new burdens. War became more organized as armies were raised to defend territory, control trade, or expand empires. Famine, when it struck, was no longer limited to small groups, but devastated entire cities. Disease spread more easily in crowded populations. The very complexity that made civilization powerful also made it fragile, dependent on systems that could collapse under pressure. The story of civilization was not a simple ascent, but a constant dance between creation and destruction, order and chaos. And yet, despite these dangers, civilizations endured and spread. By 3000 BCE, great centers had arisen in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. Each had its own unique culture, writing system, architecture, and world view, but all shared the same essential characteristics: surplus food, social hierarchy, centralized authority, monumental building, trade networks, and cultural expression. The pattern, once established, repeated across continents, shaping the destiny of humanity. What makes this transition so extraordinary is how quickly it happened in the grand scale of human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, living in small bands. In the space of a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary time, they built cities, developed writing, raised monuments, and formed states. The leap from campfire to civilization was staggering, and it changed not only how humans lived, but how they saw themselves. They were no longer merely creatures within nature. They were builders of worlds, shapers of order, participants in divine plans, authors of history. If you pause and reflect, the dawn of civilization was not inevitable. It was a choice, made and remade by countless individuals over generations: farmers planting fields, builders stacking bricks, priests chanting in temples, rulers commanding laborers, artisans shaping tools. Each choice built on the last, until a threshold was crossed, and humanity found itself living in a reality its ancestors could scarcely have imagined. The cost was high: inequality, labor, war, but the gain was immense: knowledge, continuity, creativity, and the possibility of futures larger than the span of individual lives. So what were humans doing 10,000 years ago as this transition began? They were not yet kings or emperors, not yet writing epic poems or building pyramids, but they were laying the groundwork. They were gathering in villages that grew into towns, producing surpluses that allowed specialization, forming rituals that became religions, organizing leadership that became states. They were beginning to write, to trade, to build monuments. They were creating the frameworks of civilization itself, and within those frameworks, they were imagining new ways of being human, new stories of who they were and who they might become. The dawn of civilization was not the end of history, it was its beginning. From these early cities would rise empires, nations, philosophies, technologies, and cultures that still shape our world today. The laws we follow, the religions we practice, the cities we inhabit, the technologies we depend on, all trace their lineage back to that first great leap. Tendo